MST3K, or Mystery Science Theater 3000 as it's called by people who aren't hip to the cool slang like I am, is a long-running television show that's aired more than 200 episodes across more than 30 years. It features a human host and his robot sidekicks poking fun at a bad movie. It's been enormously successful with a theatrical adaptation, stage shows, online events, and a comic book, which all of you should totally check out because the core conceit behind it is amazingly awesome, but I'm getting off topic here. MST3K is a fantastically successful show that's been quite rightly celebrated by its many, many fans. But Mystery Science Theater is also a show whose enormous cultural legacy has largely erased the very specific cultural context that it sprang from, and in the process, the show has sort of stopped meaning what it used to mean. It's hard to explain, but it's sort of like watching a movie that's satirizing a specific genre without having ever seen a movie from that specific genre. Okay, here's an example. In 1971, PBS aired a 12-episode miniseries called An American Family. It was basically a documentary that followed the life of a normal American family. At least it was supposed to, until the married couple at the center of the documentary separated and divorced. Then, in 1979, Albert Brooks made a satire of this documentary. His film, Real Life, imagines a similar project, this time undertaken not by PBS, but by a sleazy Hollywood producer. It's a very funny movie that takes direct aim at the supposedly high-minded and educational ideals of the documentarians who would impose on a family in this ludicrously invasive manner. And it hilariously skewers the conception that by watching a documentary like An American Family, audiences are supposed to be seeing real life unfolding before them, unaltered by the presence of a film crew following their actions. And yet, when I watched Albert Brooks's film for the first time, I hadn't seen An American Family, and so what was intended to be a very specific piece of satire ended up losing a lot of its intended meaning. The context changed, and so the meaning of the work itself changed along with it. And this same phenomenon happened with Mystery Science Theater 3000. Mystery Science Theater 3000 is a series where a human host and a couple of robot sidekicks watch a bad movie and make fun of it. And here I have to ask you, the viewer of this video, what is this in reference to? If Mystery Science Theater is a work of satire, what is it satirizing? What is the reference point that it's making fun of or taking off from? And here's where we're going to take a long walk to a simple point. In the days before American television was more or less uniform, there was an era where local stations had a lot, and I mean a lot, of freedom in creating content for their local markets. It's from this point in history where we get local kids shows like the Wallace and Ladmo show, which aired for 35 years in Phoenix, Arizona, Lorenzo's Cartoon Festival, hosted by Lorenzo the Tramp for around 2 decades, and King Koopa's Cool Cartoons, which only aired for a few months in Los Angeles, but you get my point. These shows were, by and large, excuses to air cartoons or other content that local stations had purchased the rights to, often very inexpensively. Captain Satellite would invite local boys and girls onto a spaceship, and together they'd watch some 30-year-old black and white cartoons, maybe a barely animated Marvel comic, and if you're lucky, a Hanna-Barbera short. Oh no, not one of your name-brand Yogi Bear or Huckleberry Hound ones. You're getting 7 solid minutes of Lippy the Lion and his good friend Hardy Har Har starring in that cartoon classic, Laugh a Loaf.
No, I don't want to buy a dandelion pruner.
Oh dear, oh my.
These programs were, by and large, ways of gussying up some, non-premium content that probably wouldn't have attracted an audience on its own. And yeah, it's kind of awesome. I mean, as much as I joke, I really do like the idea of some guy in Washington, D.C. dressing up as Captain Tug to perform skits with his parrot puppet Fantail in between episodes of Clutch Cargo and Space Angel. And is any of this starting to sound familiar? But of course, children's television shows weren't the only reference point for Mystery Science Theater. Alongside local kids shows were local horror movie shows. The formula for success was much the same, although instead of D-grade cartoons, you'd get D-grade, and presumably very inexpensive to license, horror and science fiction movies. You'd get The Count on Nightmare Theater introducing the 1973 version of Frankenstein, and Dr. Shock introducing Diary of a Madman.
And now, a Dr. Clayton Forrester presentation, Attack of the Giant Leeches.
And I should, at this juncture, point out two things. Number one, these guys were often very, very funny and irreverent. Here's Dr. Shock rising from his coffin right next to his daughter Bubbles, who was his sidekick. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, came out of this silly, ironic mode. She'd used the iconography of horror movies in her sets and costuming, but the character of Elvira knew the horror movies she was introducing were terrible. She'd make fun of them, and you, as a viewer, were meant to make fun of them too. Into this context entered Joel Hodgson. He pitched the idea of a slightly different local package show to a small Minnesota channel called KTMA. Like so many other shows, him and a few sidekicks would introduce weird, cheap, and generally pretty terrible films. But instead of just introducing them, they'd make fun of the movies and short subjects while we were watching them. It was perhaps the natural evolution of the local TV host formula. With this innovation, suddenly the terrible quality of these cheap movies became an asset, fodder for making jokes. But the context here is key. The quality that these early episodes of Mystery Science Theater had that makes them unique, I think, is that these local TV stations were gonna air junk like this anyway. By making fun of it, Mystery Science Theater 3000 made this inevitability more palatable. And even when the show moved to the more mainstream channel Comedy Central, this context carried with it to a large degree. But here's where the turn starts to happen. At a certain point, local TV stations repackaging crummy cartoons and bad horror flicks faded away. No longer were small stations scrambling to get audiences' eyes on the Mad Ghoul. And so old-fashioned bad movies from the 40s, 50s, and 60s became less ubiquitous on television. This meant that the human host of Mystery Science Theater and his merry band of robots were no longer poking fun at some films that happened to be airing anyway. Oh no, they were now airing these films specifically to make fun of them. They searched for the best comedic fodder, for inept filmmaking, for bad acting, for awful effects, for unintelligible scripts, and brought those movies onto national television where they otherwise would have never aired, for the expressed purpose of highlighting how funny their badness was. You might expect that this would result in the show starting to feel mean-spirited or spiteful, but it didn't. The performers and writers of the show, and probably many of the folks involved, really seemed to love these awful little movies. Sure, you could make fun of how bad they were, but you couldn't be angry with them. They were so downright adorable in their shoddiness. Mystery Science Theater was having fun at the expense of these movies, but it was a good-natured ribbing that belied a grudging enjoyment. Until that stopped. I don't know when it happened, but I feel like at a certain point this stopped being the case. At a certain point, the core concept took on a tone of, I don't want to say meanness, but it seems to me that something changed in the way that I look at later episodes of MST3K, and I think it has to do with the context that they were created in. And I think this turn started to happen after the original run ended, around the time that Mystery Science Theater became a cultural institution. Between 1989 and 1995, MST3K aired 128 episodes on Comedy Central, 128 films that they dragged through the comedic ringer. And then they moved to the Sci-Fi Channel, where they made fun of 48 more. And then, well, what? The show ended in 1999, 11 years after it had premiered on local television, and these fresh-faced comedic minds, some of whom had spent the better part of a decade making fun of how bad other people's works were, went on to tell their own stories, to develop their own comedic masterpieces, to write books, produce films, and star in TV shows that would light the world on fire. No. Sorry. Joel Hodgson created a failed pilot for HBO called The TV Wheel, which combined an extraordinarily complicated premise, an enormously expensive filming mechanism, puppets, forced perspective, and sketch comedy to create something that ended up being more ambitious than it was funny. Oh, fun fact, Joel Hodgson ends up spending more than 13 minutes of the pilot's runtime explaining how the concept behind the show works. He also apparently wanted to make a TV show called Jolly Filter that added funny CGI and sound effects to old movies, though that went nowhere. Trace Beaulieu and Josh Weinstein wrote for America's Funniest Home Videos for a while, mocking home movies. Kevin Murphy wrote a book about seeing bad movies, as did Michael J. Nelson. And then, well, Joel Hodgson created Cinematic Titanic, a series where he and other MST3K alums made fun of bad movies. Mike Nelson created Riff Tracks, a sort of podcast where he and other MST3K alums made fun of bad movies in real time. And he also created a podcast where he makes fun of bad novels like Tech War and Ready Player One. And he hosted a series called The Film Crew, where he and other MST3K alums, well, no points for guessing what they did. And then Mystery Science Theater 3000 itself returned, this time on Netflix, and again we got more of the same, more seeking out terrible content for the expressed purpose of pointing out how badly made it is. But this time you've got Patton Oswalt and Felicia Day there alongside Neil Patrick Harris, Jerry Seinfeld, Mark Hamill, Joel McHale, and apparently Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland from Rick and Morty contributed to the writing, with frequent Community and Parks and Recreation director Rob Schrab serving as co-director for one of the show's seasons. But why? I mean, if you've got all that comedic talent, why are you wasting it making fun of Atlantic Rim and Mac and Me? Because it's funny, I hear you say, and I guess that's true. And as someone who just recently released a video making fun of the Brady Bunch Variety Hour, I can't criticize the gentle mockery of bad media. But what is the point of it? Pointing out how obviously bad movies are obviously bad? That movies that nobody likes and that have been forgotten to history are unlikable and deserve to be forgotten to history? We no longer live in a world of Lorenzo's cartoon festivals and nightmare theaters. Today you can choose what you want to watch whenever you want to watch it. You can stream any episode of any television series that you can think of. No one is forcing us to sit down and watch these movies, and so the context of Mystery Science Theater has changed. And when it moved to Netflix, that context didn't make a lot of sense. So what is the context of MST3K today? Well, it's Riff Tracks, The Film Crew, 372 pages we'll never get back, Mike Nelson's movie Mega Cheese. The context is one that they helped to create. The context is stuff like The Nostalgia Critic, Honest Trailers, and Cinema Sins. The context is a culture that loves making fun of bad content. And in this new context, maybe it's time for MST3K to reinvent itself, to do something really radical, to try something bizarre and innovative. Remember that crazy pilot Joel Hodgson made in the 90s? Do something in that spirit, but now and on the internet. And you want to know something really cool? It might actually happen. After an enormously successful crowdfunded campaign, Joel Hodgson is bringing back Mystery Science Theater 3000 again, but this time it's not going to Netflix. It's going to air on something called the GIZMOPLEX, a streaming platform of Joel Hodgson's own design. Reading Hodgson's description of the GIZMOPLEX on his Kickstarter page, I can feel his enormous excitement. He says, "I don't just want the GIZMOPLEX to be a site where you watch MST3K video content. See, as great as Hulu and Netflix and Disney Plus are, the way you use them is really specific. What I mean is, no one is interacting on those sites. You go there to watch content by yourself or with someone sitting next to you on the couch, and that's it. When you come to the GIZMOPLEX, I really want you to feel like you're entering a new kind of virtual theater, where you can meet up with friends, grab a snack from the concession stand, check out the coming attractions, and riff on your favorite long-forgotten cheesy movie together, just like our characters do." The new context for MST3K, it would seem, is the internet and its capacity to bring people together. The goal is to use bad movies to unite people. He goes on to spend 10 paragraphs comparing the GIZMOPLEX to game day for the Green Bay Packers in Wisconsin, and contrasts normal website blueprints with his plans. I want the GIZMOPLEX to succeed, and I want Joel Hodgson to walk into the streaming environment of the 21st century and to do what he did to the media landscape of the late 1980s. And the crazy, awesome, inspiring thing about Joel Hodgson is that when I hear him talk about this, I feel like he just might do it. So, I hope I didn't get too negative there in the middle section, and I hope I didn't insult anyone who's a huge MST3K fan, but I don't think the show is above a little light criticism, and I hope that maybe I've given you some food for thought. And if you're hungry for more, I've got some more videos on the channel that you might like, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe, and I really want to thank you for watching. Have a great day.